forgotten trail. The wind howls across a barren plain, scattering dust across the earth like a whisper from a time before time. The sky above is iron grey, stretched tight over a land neither dead nor alive. A pair of footprints lies frozen in volcanic ash, undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. What you are looking at is not a fossil. It is not an artifact. It is a memory written in skin and bone and the weight of 1,000 silent journeys. This is a trail, and at the end of this trail is you. What if I told you that the story of Europe did not begin with kings or empires with swords or flags, but with bare feet pressed into wet soil? What if I told you that everything we are, our language, our skin, our fears, our dreams, began with a single step taken into the unknown? Long before borders, long before names, there was only the tribe and the trail. It began over 50,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. A band of humans, no more than 20 or 30, stood at the edge of a vast continent they had never seen. To the west, rivers that coiled like sleeping serpents. To the north, ice. To the east, mountains sharp enough to tear clouds, and in front of them, the mystery of Europe. They didn't know what waited for them. They didn't know about the cousins, Neanderthals, already there. They didn't know about the storms, the hunger, the betrayals, the love stories, the inventions, the near-deaths, the rebirths. They just walked. They followed herds, followed fire, followed instinct, followed hope, because something inside them, a whisper, a hunger, a song, refused to stay still. And that refusal, that was humanity's beginning. We call them Homo sapiens now, as if a name could capture their fire. We trace their path in fossilized bone and napped flint, but they did not think of themselves as history. They did not know they were the first Europeans. They were just trying to survive. One breath, one fire, one child at a time. The footprints they left behind, found in caves and riverbanks, in ash and in ice, tell a story far older than Rome, older than writing, older than gods. They speak of babies born in snowstorms, of mothers humming lullabies while sharpening blades, of brothers fighting over meat, of daughters who painted bison in firelit caves. They speak of a people who had no word for destiny, only the journey. We find those footprints now, perfectly preserved in hardened ash, and we call them miraculous. But they were not miracles to the people who made them. They were burdens. They were life. The first tribe to enter Europe didn't come as conquerors. They came as wanderers. They came in search of food, in search of warmth, in search of something they couldn't name but felt burning in their bones. They did not know they were the authors of an unspoken saga. They did not know they would become ancestors to an entire continent. And neither do we. We too move forward blindly. We too carry stories in our DNA that we do not understand. The shape of your nose, the curl of your hair, the way your skin burns or tans in sunlight, these are echoes of them, of those first barefoot steps into Europe's wilderness. Their fire still burns in your blood. Their breath still rises in your lungs. You're not separate from them. You're not modern. You're not new. You're a continuation, a chapter they began. Somewhere in a Spanish cave, a child pressed a hand against stone and blew ochre pigment across her fingers, leaving behind a red silhouette. Her body has turned to dust. But her hand still reaches for us, still asks, "Will you remember?" Because that's what this story is, a remembering of who we were, of what we endured, of how we became. And make no mistake, they endured. They crossed frozen rivers barefoot. They gave birth beside dying fires. They sang songs we'll never hear to gods we'll never know. They watched the sun rise on mountains that no longer exist. And they buried their dead with flowers. Why? Because even then, even in that primal age, they were not animals. They were becoming something else, something terrible, something beautiful, something human. And so the trail begins. A forgotten trail, Marked not by milestones, but by blood, not by maps, but by memory, not by dates, but by footprints in the snow. They didn't walk into Europe as one people, but by the time they left their mark, they had become ancestors, and we had become their legacy. So take a breath. Let it fill your chest. That oxygen passes through lungs shaped by 50,000 years of adaptation. That heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, keeps time to a drum first beaten beside a fire in an open plain. This is not their story. This is yours. This is ours. You carry their silence in your bones. You carry their questions in your blood. You carry their breath in your lungs. And this is the journey they left behind. Born of fire, bred by sky. Before we walked into Europe, before our shadows touched the cold stones of the north, we were children of fire, and the sky was our first god. Our story does not begin in a cave. It begins under an open sun, in a place where the earth cracked with heat, where lions roared louder than thunder, and the grass swayed like golden ocean waves. East Africa, the cradle, the forge, where bones grew tall under acacia trees, where hands first shaped stone, where minds kindled something no other creature could grasp, imagination. We weren't the only ones walking the savannah. Other hominins lived there too, tall, clever, resourceful. But something in our lineage changed. A whisper in the genes, a glitch in the brain, an opening in the dark. We didn't just see. We remembered. We dreamed. We wondered why. And that dangerous, beautiful capacity was the beginning of everything. Anthropologists call it the cognitive revolution. But to the tribe it felt like something simpler, like voices in the wind, like pictures on the back of their eyelids, like the knowledge that a shadow was more than a shape. It was a warning. It was a ghost. The first sparks of memory ignited, then language. Not just grunts or calls, but structure, meaning, songs that named things, words that conjured what wasn't there. A line in a story could be just as real as the one at the waterhole. We told tales around fires, passed down not just how to survive, but why we must. Not just what to fear, but who we were. That was the moment, the fracture, the point where Homo sapiens stopped being just an animal and became a myth maker, and the world would never be the same. With myth came memory, and with memory came identity, and with identity came grief. We began to bury our dead, to mourn, to honour. We made tools from the bones of loved ones, hung beads from the necks of the fallen. We remembered names long after the bodies returned to dust. The Neanderthals would do this too, later, but we did it first. Not better, just first. But even paradise is fragile. The climate began to shift. Rains disappeared. Grasslands turned to dust. Rivers shrank into cracked scars on the land. Camps moved. Children cried from hunger, herds vanished, and the fire in our blood, the one born in Africa, began to whisper, there must be something more, something north, something new. Not everyone listened. Some stayed, others turned east or south. But a few, just a few, stood at the edge of a canyon, watched the stars rise over a world they'd never seen, and stepped forward. They didn't know they were pioneers. They didn't know they were rewriting evolution. They were just leaving, and so began the first great human migration out of Africa. Not in armies, not in cities, but in families, in quiet caravans, in groups small enough to vanish between trees, but strong enough to move mountains over generations. The Red Sea narrowed at its southern tip. Bab el-Mandeba bridge of land when sea levels dropped, and across it, barefoot children walked into Arabia. The trail widened. Rivers led them onward. They followed gazelles and shadows. Caves gave them shelter. Stars gave them stories. Their world expanded, but their memory remained anchored to the place of origin. Africa wasn't a continent, it was a mother, and every campfire in the wild was a thread tied back to her heartbeat. The tribe changed. Slowly, their skin adapted, their lungs grew stronger, their bodies hardened in the cold winds of the north. But inside, they were still dreamers, still storytellers, still carrying the fire, and they weren't alone. In the darkness ahead in forests older than memory, something waited. Another kind of human, a cousin. But for now, they walked through silence. Each step north was a sentence in a story they didn't know they were telling. Each footprint pressed into ancient soil was a prophecy of war, of love, of extinction, of empire, of memory. They walked through deserts that would become kingdoms, past lakes that would vanish, across stones that would one day be buried beneath cathedrals. And they did it without maps, without leaders, without guarantees. Just hope and hunger and fire. They didn't know they were the beginning, but we do. We know now that all of us, every modern human, descend from that first tribe, that first whisper, that first story told beside a flickering flame. We carry their mistakes, we carry their brilliance, we carry their loneliness, and yes, we carry their breath in our lungs. Because we're born of fire and bred by sky, and the journey has only just begun. The narrow crossing. The wind blew salt into their eyes. The sun hung low like a molten coin on the horizon, and the seethed sea whispered a promise. They had reached the edge of the world they knew, and beyond it lay something else. They stood at the Horn of Africa, where the land narrows like a closing throat, and the Red Sea stretches wide, deep, dark. It was not a place for certainty, it was a place for choices. Some turned back, but others, the bold, the broken, the desperate, looked across the water and saw not danger, but a question. And then, one night, with the stars sharp enough to cut the sky, they crossed. Whether by rafts of reeds, or stepping across exposed land during an ancient drought, or walking hand in hand along a land bridge swallowed long ago by rising tides, we may never know. But they did it. Somewhere between Sinai and Bab el-Mandeb, our ancestors stepped out of Africa and into everything else. The first exodus. Not with armies, not with religion, not with empire, but with hunger and fire and a dream stitched into the rhythm of their footsteps. We call it the out of Africa migration, but for them it was simply survival. They didn't name it, they didn't map it, they just followed the fish, followed the tides, followed the scent of life on the breeze. They moved along the coasts, clinging to the edge of the world like shadows. The sea gave them food, the wind gave them direction, the moon gave them tides, and in return they gave the world their footprints. They learned to survive on shellfish and seabirds, crabs cracked between stones, fires fueled by driftwood. Salt hardened their skin, their lungs adapted to new airs, their language shifted with the wind. The ocean was not home, but it was a road, and they became its travellers. The coast became their companion, a silver thread guiding them northward past deserts, past cliffs, past lands where the sun set in strange directions. They followed the rhythm of waves like a heartbeat, and with each passing generation Africa receded behind them like a fading drumbeat. But they carried her in their bones. They carried her in their cheekbones and their stride, in the pigment of their skin, in the ache of their hips, in the lullabies their mothers whispered under starlit skies. Africa was not behind them. She was inside them. And yet the new world was not silent. It sang its own songs. The rocks were different, volcanic, brittle, sharp. The birds called in unfamiliar tones. The winds blew colder. The trees were strange, the insects unfamiliar, and the animals watched them. Jackals, lions with smaller manes, hyenas with stranger laughs. Some kept their distance, others tested the newcomers. And so humanity adapted. Again. Fires were built higher, tools were sharpened thinner, stories grew longer, prayers were whispered to new stars, because something was shifting, not just in the land but in the mind. The sea had changed them. They were no longer tied to one place, no longer bound by the shape of one mountain range or one river's course. They had become explorers, migrants, carriers of memory, builders of myth. The people who crossed the narrow passage did not look like us. They were lean, sun-browned, hard-eyed and silent. But inside them burned a fire that you still carry. The fire that asks, what's over the next ridge? What waits beyond the next horizon? That's what pulled them onward beyond Arabia, through the Fertile Crescent, into the shifting corridors of the Levant. They walked into the cradle of myth, long before Abraham, long before Babel, long before the world had names. They carved tools from obsidian, learned the moods of the moon, they built camps beside oases, and when the land dried they moved again. To them, the earth was alive, not owned but borrowed, not conquered but sung to. They left no cities, only stones turned in curious ways, bones arranged in deliberate silence, ochre on cave walls, fire scars in the dark. But these were not primitive people. They were engineers of survival, linguists of necessity, philosophers of pain. Every step away from Africa was a sentence written in the story of humanity, and the punctuation was fire. Always fire. They made it wherever they went, flint against flint, wood against wood, breath against breath. They learned to bring warmth to cold, light to darkness, meaning to silence. And faith was born on those windswept shores, not in temples, not in books, but in the knowledge that some force was watching. Something moved with the tides, something listened when they cried, something judged the hunt, something accepted the offering of a child's breath to the stars. Faith didn't begin with gods, it began with gratitude, with fear, with awe. Because when you sleep beneath a sky so vast it could swallow you, you learn to whisper your name just to remember you exist. That's what they did. They whispered. They remembered. They moved forward. And always the sea was behind them, pushing, calling, promising nothing but demanding everything. And they gave it. They gave blood. They gave tears. They gave generations. They gave you. The narrow crossing was not a bridge. It was a birth canal, and what came out the other side was not the same as what went in. It was human, but changed. Because once you leave the cradle, you can never return. Not really. Not as the same thing. And that is where the journey truly began. So look at the map. Trace your finger across the Red Sea. Feel the pulse of tides older than language. And know this. At some point, 40 or 50,000 years ago, someone who looked like you stood on that same shore, watched the moonlight shimmer on water, held a baby against their chest, and stepped into the unknown. And that's why your heartbeat still quickens at the sound of waves. That's why you still dream of crossing something. That's why the horizon still calls your name. You crossed with them, and you're still crossing. Ghosts of the Levant. The wind changed. It no longer carried the warmth of Africa. It came cooler now with the crisp bite of mountain air and the whisper of unfamiliar leaves trembling in valleys they had never seen. The tribe had followed the coast until it turned inward. Now they followed rivers ribbons of life winding through rock and time, carving canyons, watering fig trees, quenching thirsts older than language. This was the Levant, what we now call Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but to them it had no names, only meanings. A deer trail meant hope, a sudden silence meant danger, a ring of stones in a cave meant someone had come before, and someone had. They found the first signs without knowing what they were: a cracked bone with spiral fractures, a burn pattern on an ancient hearth, a flint point napped with techniques not their own. Ghosts. Not animals, not gods, not quite human, and yet familiar. They were being watched, not hunted, not greeted, just watched. It wasn't war. It wasn't love. It was something far more primal. Observation. Two species, two ways of being, meeting in silence beneath the pines. One from the south, slender, dark-skinned, clever-eyed, born of drought and fire. The other from the north, barrel-chested, broad-nosed, eyes the colour of stone, born of blizzard and endurance. They saw each other in the flickering firelight of caves, across ravines beside watering holes, and they did not charge. They did not flee. They watched. What were they thinking? We will never know. But perhaps, just perhaps, the modern humans, the newcomers, saw strength in the way Neanderthals moved through the forest, silent as snow. And the Neanderthals, in turn, saw something alien in the Homo sapiens, the way they gestured, the way they shared food in groups, the way their tools had handles. For a time, perhaps 1,000 generations, neither side attacked, neither side embraced. The Levant became a liminal space, a borderland of species, a zone of ghosts and echoes. But the land was not still. The Levant was beautiful, but it was cruel. The seasons turned like knives. The air grew dry, then bitter, then dry again. Africa did not teach them how to survive the winter, not this kind of winter. This was not monsoon and drought. This was frost. This was death in silence. They had never seen snow. The first time it fell, they mistook it for ash. Children tried to catch it on their tongues. Elders huddled together, wrapped in animal skins that were suddenly too thin. The food vanished. The rivers slowed to glass. The trees cracked. They learned quickly, or they died. The tribe split. Some fled south, back toward warmth. But others, the stubborn, the dreamers, they stayed, and watched the Neanderthals. Not openly, not with words, but in secret. They studied how the Neanderthals layered furs, how they built windbreaks from stone and hide, how they stored meat in frozen pits, how they knew when the snow would fall even before the sky did. This was not theft. This was mimicry, admiration, desperation. The modern humans copied the shelters, improved their fire rings, lined their boots with moss. They learned how to survive winter not from instinct but from observation. And still the Neanderthals said nothing, did nothing. They watched. At Shanida, at Amud, at Taban, cave after cave evidence of both species, layered in the dirt like verses of the same poem sung in different tongues. Sometimes Neanderthal, then human, then Neanderthal again. A slow-motion chess game played across 100,000 years. No checkmate, only retreat. Return. Retreat. But beneath the soil the footprints began to merge. Some fire pits used tools from both species. Some grave sites bore beads and stone points side by side. Some camps had footprints of children, one large, flat-footed, one small and narrow. And in the silence something happened. Not war, not love, but something else. Curiosity. One night, perhaps beneath a moonless sky, two young hunters from opposite worlds stood at opposite sides of a ravine, their spears drawn, their breath misting in the cold. Neither moved, neither ran, and for a long moment they simply stood. Just long enough to imagine the other not as monster but as mirror. That was how it began, not with battle, not with embrace, but with mutual breath, shared air, shared cold. Over time, the encounters became more frequent, more casual. They learned to read the signs. A broken branch meant game nearby. A pile of bones meant a cave was taken. A handprint on a wall meant someone was still alive. And perhaps that was the most human thing of all, to say silently, I was here. I still am. The Levant became a classroom, a border of becoming, a crucible for the future. Because here in these caves and riverbeds, modern humans became something more. They adapted, they incorporated, they remembered. Neanderthal strategies became part of their winter toolkits. Neanderthal silence became part of their hunting style. Neanderthal patience seeped into their bones like frost. But the cognitive revolution did not stop. The sapiens added something more. Symbols, burials with the deer antlers, ochre handprints, carved stones that served no clear purpose except to say, we are still dreaming. It was not competition, not yet. It was convergence, the beginning of something strange, something sacred. Two types of humans breathing the same air, drinking from the same streams, watching the same stars, but still strangers. Still ghosts to each other. And then climate shifted again. The cold deepened, and the tribes moved on. Some north, toward the frozen heart of Europe. Others east, toward mountains that split the sky. A few south, back into myth. But the Levant remembered them. To this day, you can walk the caves of Mount Carmel, feel the soot of their fires in the rock, kneel where they once mourned a child with flowers, and see, layer by layer, the sediment of souls. They left no temples, no pyramids, no monuments, only echoes and stone and a story whispered through DNA. The Levant was not a destination, it was a mirror, and what we saw reflected there was not just another species but ourselves, in a different shape, a different voice, a different fate. They watched us, and we watched them. And in that quiet communion, before the wars, before the loves, before the deaths, we remembered that to be human is not to conquer but to observe, to adapt, to become. The Levant still breathes with the ghosts of both peoples. If you listen closely, you can hear them. In the wind across the stones, in the hush before snowfall, in the rhythm of your own breath on a cold winter night. Because winter didn't teach us how to die. It taught us how to stay. The bottleneck. There was a time when the human race nearly vanished. Not in war, not in battle, not by enemy hands, but by silence, by ash, by cold, by hunger so deep it echoed in the bones of children not yet born. It happened 70,000 years ago, though time has worn away the edges. No scroll recorded it, no monument marks it, only the whisper of genes, the echo of patterns in our blood tells the truth. Once we were nearly gone. It began with fire, not the kind we made, but the kind that makes itself. Mount Toba, a sleeping titan in what is now Indonesia. It stirred, it groaned, and then it erupted, a roar that tore through the sky, heard not in decibels but in centuries. It was the largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years. Ash rose into the heavens, thick as cities, darker than memory. It spread like a shroud, a veil over the sun, and the world began to dim. They called it a volcanic winter, but it was something worse. The skies turned grey, then black, then grey again. For months, maybe years, the sun never fully returned. And with it went the food. Plants withered, animals wandered, confused, then collapsed. Rivers slowed, Birds stopped singing, and humans, those brilliant, fire-bearing children of Africa, they began to starve. The great migrations paused. The coast grew quiet. Caves once warmed by laughter and flame went dark. In the data, the DNA you carry, there is a scar, a thinning of variation, a signal so sharp it cuts through time. It tells us that somewhere around this moment the human population dropped to a few thousand at most, perhaps just 600 breeding adults, 600, on a planet that had once teemed with their dreams. Let that number sink in. Not a village, not a city, not even a crowd. A family, a tribe. One flickering ember left on a windswept branch. If the wind had blown harder, you wouldn't be here. If the ash had lingered longer, there would be no words, no cities, no songs, no you. They huddled in pockets of the earth, some in the shadowed coasts of South Africa, others in the forests of the Levant. Some retreated into caves, curling into themselves like leaves. They did not know they were endangered. They didn't have a name for extinction, but they could feel it, in the quiet of their bellies, in the way mothers stopped singing, in the way children's eyes grew wider, not with wonder, but with waiting. The air changed, colder, heavier. Ash fell like snow, coating the ground in silence, spoiling water, choking lungs. And still they endured. Fire was no longer for warmth. It was survival, a barrier against darkness, against death. The tribe became small. Each loss was a calamity, each birth a miracle. Every child was the hope of a species. There were no strangers, only kin, only those who remembered the same taste of roots, the same cave walls, the same night cries. They carved smaller tools, preserved every scrap. They ate less, moved less, but their minds did not shrink. In fact, they grew sharper, because necessity demands genius. In that silence, they innovated. They learned to track game with almost nothing, to read the wind like scripture, to listen to the soil with their bare feet. They began to plan for hunger before it came. They made memory into method, story into strategy. They learned to fish with traps, to ferment plants, to store water in hollowed stones, and most importantly, they learned to trust. Trust became currency. The tribe was no longer just a band of individuals. It became a single organism, a heart beating in many chests. One failed hunt hurt everyone. One child's illness became the tribe's burden. They did not have politics. They had survival, and survival meant unity. Language deepened. Grunts became metaphors. Gestures became rituals. You needed to communicate not just action, but intention, fear, memory. The first sparks of myth may have been born not to explain the gods, but to carry the weight of loss, to explain why the sun no longer shone, why a child didn't wake, why the rivers had forgotten their paths. They were not fools, they were poets with no pen, and in the darkness of that age they carried fire inside. That's what the bottleneck was, a funnel, a crucible, a test not of strength but of endurance. It did not favour the biggest, the strongest, the fastest. It favoured the ones who could cooperate, who could comfort, who could wait. 600 breeding humans, not heroes, not kings, just survivors. Their names are lost, their faces forgotten, but their blood is in you. Every person alive today descended from that narrow gate of existence. You are the echo of that tribe, the dream of those few, the hope carried on thin ribs and tired feet. It is a strange legacy, to come from the brink of nothing, to be born of a near silence, to be the child of survivors who never meant to write history only to endure it. But perhaps that's why we are the way we are, why we fear silence, why we crave community, why we seek warmth, why we tell stories. Because once, long ago, we were almost no one, and in that void we found each other. The bottleneck did not break us. It defined us. Every time you light a fire, you're honouring their memory. Every time you look up at the stars and wonder, you're continuing what they began. Every laugh is resistance, every song a defiance, every birth a celebration of that narrow survival. We are not many, we never were, but we are enough, because they were enough. 600 souls and one ember of light. That was all it took to keep the story going, into the gate of stone. They called nothing by name. Not yet. But if they had, they might have called it the gate of stone because that's what it was. A threshold, a passage, a mouth between mountains, a breath held by the earth. The tribe stood at its edge, where the land buckled like a sleeping beast, where the sun dipped early and rose late, where rivers clawed their way through ancient rock. Behind them, the warmth of the Levant, the memory of firelight on cave walls, the shared breath of ghosts and cousins. Ahead of them, silence. Stone. Europe. They didn't know the name, but they felt its weight in their bones. It was colder here, not the sudden frost of a cruel night, but the steady, creeping stillness of a continent holding its breath. The glaciers had not yet arrived in full, but they loomed white walls on the far horizon, pale monsters inching forward with the patience of death. Even the wind was different, sharper, less forgiving, didn't whistle, it cut. Still they moved forward, not out of conquest, not out of hunger for new lands, but because the old lands could no longer hold them. The tribe had grown, new mouths, new questions, new dreams that outgrew the caves of yesterday. So they walked through Anatolia, where rivers ran like veins over bones of limestone, through the Caucasus, where mountain peaks tore at the sky like teeth. They followed the herds mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer giants wrapped in fur older than memory. They tracked them not with maps, but with stories, with instinct, with the art of listening to silence. The first signs of this new world came gently, a shift in the light, a longer winter, the crunch of snow beneath footfalls that once knew only dust. They saw trees they didn't recognize, breathed air that stung their lungs, tasted water colder than anything they had ever known. And still they kept moving, because the rivers still flowed, and the herd still moved, and the fire still burned. They carried their flame inside seashells and horn, wrapped in dried moss, cradled like children. To lose it meant death, so they guarded it, like memory, like myth. At night the tribe gathered around it, its crackle the only voice brave enough to speak to the cold, and the cold listened. Because here the land was not kind, it was not cruel either. It was simply ancient. It watched. It waited. And as the humans moved deeper into its silence, the land asked a question. Who are you to come here? Not with words, with wind, with distance, with the sudden stillness of a forest when a stranger walks in. And the tribe answered in the only way they could. They survived. They learned the tracks of the snow hare. They watched the frost form on sleeping mammoth's breath. They learned to scrape hides better, to trap, to share. They listened to the crunch of ice under elk hooves, learned which moss meant shelter was near, which cave mouth faced the morning sun. And when the blizzards came, not storms, but slow, suffocating veils of white, they huddled together. Shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath. They sang. Low rhythmic sounds, not songs not yet, but something like lullabies, something to hold the dark back. And the land listened again, not with ears, with ice. It did not yield, but it did not reject them, because the tribe was not a threat, Not yet. They were small, quiet, careful. They hunted with purpose, took only what they needed, honoured what they killed. Each mammoth became a monument, the bones arranged with care, the tusks left upright like gates, as if to say, "We remember." Because the cold taught them reverence, and reverence became ritual. They carved symbols into antlers, they stacked stones by rivers, they left red handprints on cave walls, not to claim the space, but to ask for permission. They were not alone here, they could feel it. The Neanderthals had come this way too. Sometimes the footprints overlapped, sometimes they crossed, but often, just often enough, they disappeared entirely, as if the other people had simply melted into the snow. But signs remained. A burnt hearth under a rock shelf, a woven net tangled in a tree, a skull left on a high ledge, looking east. Messages without language. And still the tribe pressed deeper. They reached the plains, endless fields of frozen grass, where reindeer moved like waves, where wolves howled, not as warning but as challenge. They began to split, not from fear but from growth. Small bands broke off, cousins, lovers, friends. Some followed the mammoths west, others turned north toward the great ice. A few wandered east, disappearing into myth, but they all carried the same flame, the same stories, the same songs sung to sleeping children beneath fir and stone. It was here, in the shadow of mountains older than dreams, that humanity passed a test, not of domination, but of humility, because Europe did not bend to their will, they bent to hers, and in doing so, they became something new, tougher, quieter, wiser. They began to mark the seasons, to track the stars, to bury their dead with care. A boy was laid to rest with red ochre on his face, a woman with shells in her hair, a man with a flint blade placed gently on his chest. Not just loss, legacy. In time they gave the land a name, not spoken, but understood. Not in words, but in breath. The gate of stone. It had not crushed them, it had welcomed them on its own terms. And as the glaciers crept closer, as the nights grew longer, as the tribe disappeared into the heart of this new world, the land listened one last time. To the soft footfalls, to the quiet laughter, to the rhythm of firelight and memory, and it did not answer. Because it didn't need to. The tribe was here, and it would remember. Because it always had. Clash of the cousins, they saw the eyes first. Not beasts, not prey, but not them either. Eyes that shimmered red in the firelight, set deeper in broad faces beneath thick, furrowed brows like the crests of storm clouds. The tribe had wandered farther than ever before, through forests that sighed with ancient winds, across rivers that ran colder than bone, and in the caves above the valley someone was already watching. Not animals, not shadows, something closer, something older. Neanderthals. The others. Not enemies, not yet. Not friends, not ever, not quite. But something in between. Cousins. Two branches from the same broken tree. Two versions of what humanity could have been. One, tall, lean, with long legs and sharper chins, minds fluid like rivers, mouths shaping the early ghosts of myth. The other, broad, powerful, muscle-packed, built for cold, for silence, for a world that hit harder than words ever could. They had ruled these lands for 300,000 years. And now, in the blink of evolutionary time, strangers stood at their hearth. Uninvited, uncertain, unaware. There was no welcome, but there was no war, not at first. Just stillness, a pause so heavy it bent time. Then came the test. A hunt, a crossing, a trail too close, a deer that bled across boundaries. The first skirmish wasn't a battle, it was a warning. A thrown stone, a cracked rib, a blood trail that ended beneath pine trees. It was short, brutal, efficient. Neanderthals did not posture. They did not threaten. They struck, hard, fast, and disappeared. The tribe retreated. For a day, maybe two. But something strange happened. They didn't leave. They circled back, made camp downstream, lit fires under overhangs just outside Neanderthal caves. They stayed. Why? Because the land offered no easy road back. Because the glaciers behind them whispered death. Because ahead was meat, shelter, water, and a cousin who could kill. Or teach. Or both. And so the uneasy coexistence began. At first there were lines. Invisible. Understood. Don't cross the ravine, don't hunt the east wood, don't approach the cave mouth at night. But then the winter deepened, and boundaries began to bend. A mammoth fell near both camps, too large to drag, too valuable to waste. They approached it from opposite sides, weapons in hand, eyes wide. Then a gesture. Not peace, not submission, but practicality. They worked together, split the kill, shared the marrow, ate in silence, just meters apart. 2 tribes, 2 species, and a single fire. The first shared hearth. It wasn't trust, but it was survival. And survival softened fear. Soon there were nods, gestures, imitations. A Neanderthal child mimicked the way a Homo sapiens woman tied her hair with sinew. A sapiens man copied the way a Neanderthal cracked femurs for marrow without splintering them. Tools were examined, handled, traded, unintentionally at first, left behind, picked up, then kept. The lines blurred. Fire was no longer just heat, it became witness to a new kind of story. There were still fights, still ambushes, still blood spilled over game trails and water rights. But there were also nights when both sides watched the stars together, not as kin, not as rivals, but as humans who dreamed of warmth and feared the dark. There were whispers among the tribe, that the Neanderthals knew the land better, that they could smell storms, predict herd movement, feel the snow before it fell. And from the Neanderthals, whispers too, that these tall strangers had fire in their mouths, that they shaped sound in ways that called birds from trees, that they wove dreams in gesture and tone, that they saw what could be, not just what was. Curiosity grew, suspicion faded, then something else crept in. Fascination. One night a Neanderthal woman sat closer to the sapiens' fire than she should have. She watched the way the flame danced in a boy's eyes as he told a story with his hands, mimicking the great elk and the clever fox. She didn't understand the words, but she understood. Another night, a sapiens hunter found a Neanderthal snare in the snow, simple, elegant. He studied it, didn't steal it. He left his own trap beside it, a different design, a silent reply. The next morning, both traps were gone. In their place, meat, an offering, a truce, a message. And so the dance continued. Moments of warmth, frayed by sudden cold. A Neanderthal man brought a wounded child into the sapiens camp once. He didn't speak, he didn't stay, he just laid her down and vanished. The child lived, and with her, a bridge. But not all stories ended in kindness. Some tribes didn't adapt, some sapiens attacked unprovoked, some Neanderthal clans vanished into snow after one too many raids. There was no grand treaty, no council. Just 1,000 years of whispers, a million silent choices that nudged the two species closer, then farther, then together again. Somewhere along the line, the first child was born. Not Neanderthal, not sapiens, but something in between. A boy with wide shoulders and clever eyes. A girl with dark skin and pale eyes. They were outliers, curiosities. Then they became common, hybrids, carriers of two worlds, symbols of a truth no one could name. We were becoming each other. Even as we feared, even as we fought, even as we tried to draw lines in snow, we blurred them. Not just in blood, but in thought. Sapiens began to use Neanderthal spearheads shorter, denser, designed for close combat. Neanderthals began to carve ornaments, beads, pendants, symbols. Both began to bury their dead more carefully, with tools, with flowers, with meaning. The caves began to look alike. Stories began to echo. And in the flicker of that shared fire, a new kind of humanity began to form. One that was not entirely one thing, not entirely another, but both, together, reluctantly, inevitably. Because the truth is simple. When two cousins clash long enough, often enough they either destroy each other, or become family. And we chose both. The Neanderthals would fade, not in fire, not in genocide, but in embrace, in mingled breath, in children who looked like neither parent and both. Clash was never the whole story, because beneath every wound was wonder, beneath every rivalry, recognition, and beneath every enemy's brow a mirror, blood in the snow, fire in the veins. It began not with war, not with conquest, not with fire or fang, but with a glance, a hesitation, a shared breath in the cold. Two shapes in the snow, one broad and ancient, the other tall and new, not speaking, not fighting, just seeing. For a long time they had circled one another, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, like planets caught in opposing gravity wells. But something shifted. The walls of ice pushed harder. The herds moved less often, and the nights they grew longer. Fire became everything. And sometimes that fire was shared. It wasn't love, not at first. It was proximity. It was hunger. It was warmth. Two hands reaching for the same flame. Two bodies under the same hide. The first unions were awkward, unspoken, fumbling across difference. Different scents, different rhythms, different expectations. But the same need to touch, to be touched. And from that something impossible was born, a child. Not Neanderthal, not sapien, but both. A fusion, a contradiction, a future. The child's brow was heavy, but her eyes were wide. Her hands were strong, but her gait was light. She cried like one tribe, but dreamed like the other. And when she laughed, both camps stopped to listen, because her voice held something strange, something not heard before, something new. More came after. Boys with thick necks and agile limbs, girls with firelit eyes and shadows in their jawlines. Children of the in-between. They were watched, feared, protected, revered. Some called them miracles, others monsters. But all knew this. The old order had changed. Something was mixing in the marrow, in the blood, in the song. And once mixed it could never be separated again. The snow bore witness. Red footprints where two bodies had lain, bones buried together, songs hummed in harmony that had no known root. The hybrid children learned fast. They carried memory deeper, their brains larger than Neanderthals, denser than sapiens. They began to see patterns in the stars, in the frost, in the way reindeer migrated. They asked questions no one had shaped words for yet. And their answers, tools, not just sharper, but smarter. Neanderthal flint shaped with sapien precision, throwing spears designed for distance but weighted for power, blades etched with strange symbols, not useful but meaningful. Then came the sounds. It started with rhythm. Stone on wood, bone on hide, the pulse of something ancient reborn in hands too young to understand its echo. Then tone, voice layered over rhythm, rise and fall, a call across valleys, a name maybe. The first breath of music. It didn't belong to sapiens, it didn't belong to Neanderthals. It belonged to them, the third people, the children of fire and snow. And with music came memory. They began to bury their dead differently, side by side, cousins, lovers, enemies, wrapped in furs decorated in shell-toothed stone, and in their hands, gifts, a flint shaped like a tooth, a carved mammoth bone, a feather from a bird that never flew. These were not offerings. These were stories. Stories that could not be told by either tribe alone, only by those who carried both in their blood. And as their numbers grew, the tribes began to change. There were still pure Neanderthals, still pure sapiens, but fewer. And increasingly they looked to the hybrids, not with contempt, but with wonder. Because the hybrids were solving things. How to preserve meat for months, how to stitch hide without puncture, how to mimic the wolf's cry to distract the prey herd. One boy invented a sling, another a way to boil snow using heated stones. They weren't just adapting, they were evolving. Faster, smarter, together. And around them, the world began to shift. The glaciers thickened, the stars wheeled into colder patterns. The old tribes would not survive this new age, not alone. But these children, these fusions, they had fire in their veins, and they carried it forward. Sometimes the unions didn't hold. There were tribes that rejected the hybrids. Fathers who wouldn't speak to sons with strange brows. Mothers who mourned daughters with unfamiliar skin. Some hybrids were exiled. Others died in childbirth. The Neanderthal womb, designed for broader skulls, often could not birth a sapient-sized head. And yet some lived. And those who lived thrived. They became the ones who spoke both tongues, who knew both hunting grounds, who could read both silence and speech. Bridges. Between worlds that once only clashed. They began to move farther, crossing lands neither tribe had dared alone, mapping not just rivers and herds, but meaning. They traced constellations. They carved time into bones. They made necklaces out of questions no one could answer. They lit fires in caves no sapiens or Neanderthal had touched. And in the flicker of those flames they painted. Red ochre spirals, hands, both large and small, stamped side by side. Eyes, animals, dreams. A record of something becoming, not Neanderthal, not sapiens, human. Truly, fully, terrifyingly human, born of difference, bred in the cold, carried by stories and screams and songs. They were not better, just different, not perfect, just possible. And that possibility, that fragile, defiant, beautiful fusion changed everything. It echoed forward, in every jawline and in every nightmare, in every lullaby. We still carry it, in the way we cry out when we're born, in the way we dance when we forget to be afraid, in the way we tell stories to feel less alone. Because we are the children of that snow, of that fire, of that blood, hybrids, mosaics, mirrors of the collision that made us. We are not pure, never were. We are the third people, the ones who came after the clash, who carry the scars and the gifts. And when we look into the mirror and see shadows behind our eyes, that's them. The cousins, the mothers, the others, still whispering in the flicker of the flame, still singing through our skin, still shaping what it means to be human. the great retreat. The cold came slowly. At first, it whispered. A sharper wind, a longer frost, a silence in the trees where birds once sang. Then came the snow. At first it dusted the earth like sugar. Then it blanketed it, thick, wet, endless. Then, not on the rivers, not just on the ponds, on everything. Glaciers crept across the north like slow beasts with silver backs. Mountains disappeared beneath their weight. Forests cracked and screamed as bark split under frozen veins. And the skirt became white, endless, empty, white. The Ice Age had deepened, and the humans, those fragile, fire-bound wanderers, ran. They fled south, step by step, day by day, tribe by tribe, retreating into the ribs of the land, into caves, into darkness. The caves were not new. They had always been there. Mouths in the cliffs, secrets behind waterfalls, openings in the earth like wounds. But now they became something more. Not shelter, sanctuary. Stone wombs to hide from the sky. The tribes brought everything with them. Fire, flint, infants wrapped in furs, and stories. So many stories. Of what the cold had taken, of who had not made it, of the sun that had vanished and might never return. Whole families disappeared in the snow. Mothers gave birth beneath hanging icicles, their cries swallowed by the wind. Sometimes the babies lived, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they froze in the arms of mothers who kept rocking them days after their hearts stopped. Winter was not a season. It was a predator, and it hunted slowly, one breath at a time. One fire at a time. And fire became everything. It wasn't heat, it wasn't light, it was hope. They fed it even when they had no food. They fed it with carvings, with bundles of dried herbs, with the bones of their dead. And in return the fire gave them memory. It danced, and they remembered the elk hunt. It hissed, and they remembered the glacier's scream. It flickered, and they told of gods who once walked among them. Somewhere in that endless dark, story became survival. They began to shape tales the way they shaped stone, with care, with meaning. They told of a son that had gone into hiding, ashamed of the cruelty of men. They told of a woman made of snow and breath, who took children who didn't listen. They told of the first fire, stolen from the sky by a clever girl who tricked a sleeping spirit and ran for her life with her hands ablaze. The children listened, eyes wide, bellies hollow, and they believed, because belief was warmer than truth, and truth was too cruel to feed a child. The storytellers became something more, priests. Their words weren't just tales, they were maps, they were spells, they were medicine. A story could hold a memory for 50 winters. A story could make you forget the cold for 5 minutes. A good story was worth more than meat. The caves filled with them, painted on walls, carved into bones, pressed into soft mud that froze like stone. Spirals, eyes, animals with too many legs. Dreams maybe, fears certainly. A record of a world collapsing. But in the collapse something emerged, a rhythm. The tribes began to move less. They stayed near their fires, near their stories, near the bodies of their dead, now buried deeper inside the caves. And in the stillness they began to think. Not just react, but think. They experimented with pigments, with tanning hides, with boiling snow. They made dolls of clay. They played music on bone flutes. They braided hair into impossible patterns to mark time, or perhaps just to remember beauty in a world that had none left. And the children? They began to mimic the songs of wind. They grew quiet, alert. Their eyes learned to track light the way others had once tracked prey. They asked questions no one could answer. Why did the sky go away? Why do we still see breath if our fathers don't? Will the sun remember us? And the answers? Stories. Because only stories could carry hope across generations. And hope was all they had. Fire and story. The twin gods of the Ice Age. Some say this was the time when humans became truly human. Not in muscle, not in brain, but in the desperate need to dream while dying. Because dreaming meant a future, and survival was not just about flesh, but about meaning. Caves once meant retreat. Now they meant rebirth. They became canvases, cathedrals, crypts. A boy might be born in the same chamber where his great-grandfather had died. A girl might paint over a mammoth drawn by hands long gone, time folded in on itself. And somewhere, in one of those wombs of stone, someone whispered the first myth. We are the last fire. And others believed it, and carried it forward. A fire that had no fuel but memory. A story that had no ending but warmth. Outside, the ice marched south. Inside, a people who should have died kept breathing, kept singing, kept painting their stories across the walls of a world that no longer wanted them. And every child born in that age carried one message in their veins. You're made of ash and story. You're the warmth that defies the dark. You're the great retreat, become the great return. And somewhere just beyond the ice, spring waited. But they didn't know that yet. They only knew the cave, the fire, the silence, and the stories that refused to die. Songs in the cave. They didn't call it art. They didn't need a word for it. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't expression. It wasn't even beauty. It was remembrance. It was ritual. It was survival, painted in ochre and charcoal on stone. And it began in the dark. The ice still pressed at the edges of their world. The sun rarely showed its face. Blizzards howled across the plains like wolves with frozen teeth. And inside the caves the people gathered. They lit their torches. They burned marrow-rich bones for brighter light. They crawled deep into the earth past where the mammoth bones lay, past where the children whispered stories in sleep. And there, in chambers untouched by time, they began to paint. Horses, by the dozens, running, galloping, leaping through the flicker of flame. Stags with towering antlers, bison with muscle-bound shoulders, lions with too many claws. Not perfect, but alive. When the fire danced, the animals moved. When the torch swayed, the walls breathed. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. Names we gave them, but not the ones they used. They had no need to name the cathedral, only to enter it. To kneel in reverence, to shape memory into pigment, to pull spirits from stone. The walls became memory, every line a whisper, every colour a breath. Manganese black, hematite red, charcoal grey, ochre yellow. Crushed, mixed with spit or animal fat, applied with reed brushes, blown through hollow bone. Sometimes they used fingers, sometimes their palms, sometimes the stump of a burned stick, and always they sang. Yes, before language fully formed, before gods had names, they sang to the cave. Not melodies, not lyrics, but sounds that rose from the belly and curled in the throat, echoes that woke the rock, chants that turned the cave into a chamber of living breath. Songs in the cave. Not just heard, felt. They sang to remember, they sang to become. Because the animal on the wall, that wasn't a drawing. It was the animal's spirit, its soul, its pattern, its name in blood and breath. You didn't kill an aurochs until you first painted it. You didn't dream of the hunt until the cave dreamed with you. And somewhere along those stone ribs, somewhere between paint and chant, the sacred was born. Not gods, not yet, but presence, a sense that the dark was listening, that the stone remembered, that what you painted could echo beyond death. The first shamans emerged, not leaders, not warriors, but the ones who listened, the ones who walked deeper into the caves than any others. They wore antlers, painted their faces, carried bones carved with holes, early flutes perhaps. They inhaled smoke from herbs that made the eyes flutter. They bled themselves into the dirt. They spoke in voices not their own. And when they returned, they brought back visions. A bison with 3 eyes, a woman with the feet of a deer, a boy who flew into the sky, then returned with fire in his mouth. No one questioned these tales, not because they were true, but because they were useful. A vision could become a rule could become a ritual could become culture. The cave was not just home. It was the mind of the tribe, the heart, the womb, the grave. Here, time folded in on itself. A child could place her hand next to her grandfather's print and feel no distance. A hunter could whisper to a painted boar and believe it was listening. A mother could sing a birthing song and know that the cave had heard it before. And slowly, shape by shape, handprint by handprint, the symbolic was born. A red dot, a spiral, a hash mark beside a beast's flank. Were they calendars? Hunting signs? Spells? We don't know. But we know this. They meant something. Because someone kept repeating them, across caves, across centuries. The same signs, the same curves. Marks made, not for survival, but for meaning. That's the moment we changed. Not when we made tools, not when we hunted in packs, but when we painted the thing that fed us not for food, but for memory. When we drew the horse not to eat it, but to remember that it ran. When we marked the wall not to map the hunt, but to say, we were here. We saw this. We mattered. The Ice Age still howled, babies still froze in sleep, fathers still vanished in the snow. But in the cave they endured. Through story, through pigment, through the echo of a song that had no words but still knew you. And what of us? We found them, thousands of years later. We crawled into the caves with cameras and notebooks, trying to decipher the dreams of a world long gone. We found the stags. We found the handprints. We found the breath still caught in the charcoal curves. And we wept, because deep inside we remembered. The song was still in our bones, the spiral still in our dreams. We are not just descendants of those who survived. We are the children of the ones who sang to stone, the ones who made memory out of flame, who made sacred what they feared, who turned the darkness into a cathedral. They didn't call it art. They didn't need to. They just knew to paint was to pray, to sing was to return, to touch the wall was to become something more than flesh. And that never left us. Hunters of the open sky. The ice loosened its grip. Not all at once, not with a roar, but with a sigh. Slow and long and ancient. The great glaciers, which had once covered Europe like frozen gods, began to retreat. Step by step, inches per year, a patience only the earth remembers. And as the walls of ice crumbled, the sky returned, blue and wide and terrifying. The cold didn't vanish, but it softened. The wind still bit, but it no longer devoured. And in the muddy thaw of a new world, the tribes emerged from their caves. They blinked in the light. They stepped onto the plains, and they began to walk, west, north, everywhere. Their footprints fanned out across a continent once buried. France, Spain, Germany. Not those names, not yet. Just lands waiting to be claimed by memory and mammoth-blooded boots. The ice had given them silence. The caves had given them story. Now the sky gave them space. And under that sky, they became something new. Not just survivors, hunters of the open world. The land was raw, still scarred by frost, still marked by melting giants, but fertile in its chaos. Meadows bloomed where glaciers had scraped. Rivers braided themselves across the plains like silver threads. Herds moved, massive and endless. Reindeer, bison, red deer, wild horses. And behind them the humans followed, nomadic, tireless, silent as the mist that rose each dawn. They carried more than spears now. They carried the future, atlatls, spear throwers, simple tools of carved wood that turned a hunter's arm into a weapon twice its reach. A flick of the wrist, and a flint-tipped dart flew faster, farther, piercing deeper into the hide of giants. They crafted nets from woven sinew, traps from sharpened bone, snares from patience. They hunted not just with muscle, but with imagination. They read the land. They learned the pulse of the herds. They watched the wind, the stars, the migration of birds. They became part of the rhythm, not kings, but dancers. And the sky was their ceiling now, a ceiling without limit. They learned to sleep beneath it, to measure time by its moods, to dream with their eyes open, watching constellations drift like silent beasts across the dark. This was the age of motion. A season might find a tribe camped by the Loire River, singing to the fish gods and drying hides. By the next moon, they'd be in the shadow of the Pyrenees, tracking red deer through alpine passes. By autumn, their children would be dancing on the Danube's banks, painted in ochre, chanting to the river's spirit for luck and warmth. They followed the herds, but they also followed stories. And some stories had 4 legs, yellow eyes, and teeth sharp as flint. The wolves came. At first they watched, always on the edges, never close, silent shadows just beyond the firelight. Watching the humans bring down a horse, watching them strip the hide, watching them leave scraps behind. Not predators. Not quite. Not anymore. Something else. Opportunists, observers, possibilities. And then something strange happened. The humans didn't chase them away. Not always. A pup wandered close, not threatening, just curious, just hungry. And instead of a spear, a bone was thrown. It was not love, not yet. It was survival, a trade. Meat for silence, warmth for warning, companionship for loyalty. And slowly the wolves became something else. They began to understand the patterns of the humans, the meanings of their sounds, the timing of their hunts. They followed the tribes not as scavengers but as partners. They learned to howl not in alarm but in call. They circled camps not to hunt but to guard. They nuzzled the hands of children, played with bones by the fire, watched the stars with tilted heads. And the humans, they saw more than teeth and fur. They saw allies. The pups with softer ears were kept. The bold ones who didn't bite were fed. The brave ones who warned of danger were praised. And generation by generation, something was forged. Not tamed, not owned, bonded. The wolf became the dog, and the dog became family. Their howls mixed with human songs. Their prints mingled in the mud beside ours. Their bones were buried with us. In graves across ancient Europe we find them curled beside children, laid to rest with honour, adorned in red ochre and beads. The first to be domesticated. The first to sit by the fire as something more than beast. Not livestock, not prey, pack. and in doing so, they changed us. We learned to listen better, to sense danger sooner, to love beyond language. Because what else do you call it when one species lays its head on the chest of another and sleeps without fear? Under the open sky, the humans changed. Their tools became finer, their camps more organized, their tribes larger, connected by marriages, trade, ritual. But so did their hearts. They knew grief more deeply now, joy more vividly. They carved beads not just for trade, but for memory. They sang not just to the spirits, but to each other. They buried their dead with care, with flowers, with feathers, with a dog at their side. And above them, the sky watched, wide, blue, endless, and beneath it we ran. Children of story, children of blood, children of those who dared to leave the caves and hunt in the daylight, hunters of the open sky, the longest war. It didn't end with a battle. There was no final charge, no last cry echoing in a frozen valley, no heroic sacrifice, no noble surrender. The war that defined us, that carved our bones and rewired our dreams, faded like mist at dawn. And yet, it changed everything. It lasted not years, not decades, but tens of thousands of suns and snows, not between kings, but cousins, not over land, but over existence. This was the war without trumpets, fought with fire-hardened spears and eyes that stared too long across cave walls. Modern humans, Neanderthals, the last two branches of a once crowded tree. And somewhere between violence and vision, between mating and murder, own branch began to wither, the other to flourish. It began slowly, a shadow falling over the mountains, a footprint in a valley that once knew only Neanderthal steppes. The tribes were moving, spreading like roots across thawed earth. And with them came stories, tools, children. These weren't the same people who had first wandered out of Africa. They were more. Aurignacian, Gravettian, Magdalenian. We give them these names now as if they were empires. But they were cultures, ways of living, ways of remembering. Each with its own art, its own tools, its own gods. The Aurignacians carved lions in ivory. The Gravettians left statues of faceless women, fertility perhaps, or grief, or something in between. Each tribe a thread, each thread a song, and the land listened. But as our cultures bloomed, something else faded. The Neanderthals. They had ruled this place for 300,000 years, survived ice ages, fought cave lions, mastered cold and silence. Their hands had shaped these valleys, their blood had warmed these hearths. But now they were retreating cave by cave, range by range. Not all at once, not everywhere, but fading. In Iberia they held on the longest in the cliffs above the Atlantic, where the winds screamed their names. The time is merciless. Their numbers dwindled, their births slowed, their songs fell silent. And then they were gone. No tomb, no monument, just absence. And us. But here's the truth they never taught in school. We didn't replace them. We became them. Because even as the last full-blooded Neanderthal slipped into shadow, his face didn't vanish. It lived on in hybrids. Children with heavy brows and slender jaws, with Neanderthal eyes and modern human teeth, with memories not born of experience but inheritance. They were the future. But they were also ghosts, living between names, between tribes, between stories. Some were celebrated, some were feared, some forgotten. They were strong, but many were sterile. They were different, and difference then, as now, was dangerous. Imagine her. A girl born to a mother who sings in the human tongue and a father whose people are already myths. She hears two songs. She sees two worlds. She's faster, taller. Her hands remember tools neither tribe taught her. But she is always in between. When the tribe feasts, they glance at her teeth. When they chant the names of ancestors, they never say hers. She dances alone, and yet she survives. Because even when cultures fracture, even when species fade, the children carry what matters most. Continuity, fusion, change. The longest war didn't end with blood. It ended with birth, with a child who looked back at both sides and chose neither or both. And from that child came others, and from them, us. Not pure, not singular, not superior, hybrid, layered, survivors of a war most never knew they were fighting. The Aurignacians moved west, the Gravettians moved north, new tools emerged, new stories bloomed. But buried deep in the bone beneath the rituals and languages were whispers of those who came before, of cousins, of firelight lovers, of foes turned family. You carry their breath in your lungs, you carry their battles in your spine. That ache in your knee, it remembers their walks. That second eyelid fold, a legacy of survival under glacial skies. That gene that helps you wake early, a Neanderthal whisper. We didn't win. There were no winners, only those who adapted, those who endured. And as the cultures grew apart, as Europe filled with new symbols, new dances, new deaths, the war faded from memory, not because it ended, but because it became us. It shaped how we think, how we fear, how we love. The longest war didn't just change history, it became history. It wrote itself in our DNA. And every heartbeat since every song, every murder, every dream has carried echoes of those final days, when humans met their match and merged. So look around at the cities, the ruins, the cathedrals and campfires, the dreams we call progress. You are not just the child of sapiens. You are the remnant of a war that left no victors, only us. And in your blood the memory of heavy footsteps in a snow-covered cave, of a spear thrown in fear, of a hand reaching across species lines to pull a child into the firelight. You are the end of the war. You are the proof it never really ended. And you are the future of something older than victory. The river children. Before the wheel, before the plough, before the written word, there was the river. Not just water, not just a line across the land. A god, a guide, a giver of life. And as the Ice Age loosened its jaws and the world softened, the tribes came out of the caves and looked for something that moved, something that connected, something that pulsed like a vein across the body of the earth. They followed the sound of flowing water. They followed it until they stopped. And where they stopped, they stayed. The Danube, the Rhine, the Seine, their names came later. Their power came first. These rivers had carved their paths long before humans dreamed of fire. They cut through the cold, through forest and stone, and offered something the open sky could not. Continuity. Direction, memory. And so the tribe settled near them, not all at once, but slowly like moss gathering on a rock. They built their camps beside the currents. They cleaned their wounds in the shallows. They sang to the ripples. Because rivers weren't just places, they were beings, alive, hungry, mysterious, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, and always watching. Life by the river was different. Not easier, never easy, but steady. The fish came with the seasons, the reeds grew strong and tall, the clay thickened in the bends and folds, perfect for shaping. And shape it they did. Bowls, beads, idols. Hands that once carved flint and painted antelope on cave walls now moulded clay into faces round, staring sacred. Totem markings appeared. Circles within circles. Spirals like the river's own turns. Lines etched like flowing thoughts. They pressed their thumbprints into wet clay, not as mistakes as signatures. Identity was being born. For tens of thousands of years they were just humans. Hunters, gatherers, nomads. But now something was shifting. Now they began to say, we are the people of the antler. We are the firewalkers. We are the river mothers. We are the bone singers. Names, marks, borders of the soul. Tribal identity. Not imposed by language, but by symbol. Not declared with flags, but with patterns burned into bone, beads worn around necks, and idols left buried by the banks. And always the river watched. Trade began. Not markets, not coins, but exchange. A spearhead, finely flaked, traded for ochre from a distant hill. A polished shell passed from hand to hand, its origin hundreds of miles away. These weren't just goods. They were threads. Each tribe was a node, each river a road. And with every trade something else moved, stories, ideas, gods. One tribe told of a spirit that lived in the moon, another told of a cave where the bones sang, another carried songs that made the wind change direction. By the firelight a child from the Danube learned to dance the steps of a woman from the Rhine. A boy from the Seine learned to carve the same spiral as a hunter from the south. And somewhere in that shared space, that echoing network of people and water and time, the first culture began to stir. They buried their dead by the river, facing east, always east, towards the sunrise, towards rebirth. The bodies were painted in ochre, the colour of blood, the colour of life. Beads were placed around their necks, tools in their hands, food at their feet. Not for show, for journey. They believed or began to believe that the river did not just carry fish and silt and sticks. It carried souls. That just as it flowed through the land, it flowed through the world beyond. The after river, the forever current. And to walk its waters, the dead needed provisions. They needed memory. They needed love. A child stood by the shore. She watched the water bend around stones. She dropped a carved idol in and whispered a name. Not hers, her grandmother's. The idol bobbed, spun once and sank. And in that moment a ritual was born. Because that girl would grow, she would tell others. They would repeat it. It would become sacred. All rituals start with grief and memory. All gods start as people. The rivers kept changing them. They learned to move with the floods, to plant small gardens of wild grains, to return to the same camp season after season. And in doing so, they became less wild. Still nomads, but not lost. Still wanderers, but tethered now to water, to seasons, to each other. Children grew up knowing places, not just routes. They had favourite bends, sacred groves, stone altars hidden behind waterfalls, and their dreams no longer stretched only to the hunt but to the we. Who are we? Why are we here? The river didn't answer, but it listened, and sometimes that was enough. And what of the Neanderthals? Gone, yes, but not forgotten. Their blood still pulsed in many. Their tools still shaped some hands. And in the deep woods, far from the rivers, legends whispered of watchers with yellow eyes and thick brows who walked the world once and taught us fire or fear. The hybrids remembered, not in words, in instinct, in the way they shaped stone, in the way they moved. The river tribes didn't talk of Neanderthals. They talked of ancestors, of bone lords, of ice children, of those who came before and made the path possible. So, look again at the rivers, not as blue lines on a map, but as cradles, cradles of culture, of community, of memory, where the first threads of us were woven, where art flowed like silt, where identity took its first breath. We are all river children in the end, wanderers who found something constant, something living, and shaped ourselves beside it. Even now cities rise by rivers. Even now lovers walk their banks. Even now ashes are scattered into their currents. Because rivers remember, and so do we, the mothers of Europe. Before the kings, before the swords, before the gods with thunder in their fists, there were their mothers, not mythic, not symbolic, real, flesh and breath, blood and bone, the fire makers, the life bearers. They were not queens, they were not warriors, they were something older, something deeper. They were the memory of the tribe. And across the cold hills of Ice Age Europe, beneath the aurora-lit skies, their footsteps echo still. She wasn't the first woman, but she was our first mother. We call her mitochondrial Eve, not because she was alone, not because she was the only one, but because her mitochondrial DNA, that small whisper in every human cell, was passed down, unbroken, across 200,000 years. From mother to child, mother to daughter, daughter to daughter, a golden thread through time. And now, in the stone silence of Europe, her daughters stood. They carried spears, they carried children, they carried songs, and they carried the future. The men hunted mammoth and deer. They returned with meat, with tusks, with hides. But the women kept time. They watched the stars shift. They tracked the moon's pull. They noticed when the rains came late. They understood the rhythm of the earth not as conquest but as conversation. When the tribe wandered, they remembered the safest caves. When a child coughed, they remembered which roots to boil. Their knowledge wasn't carved into bone, it was whispered, repeated, sung into lullabies. Oral history, matriarchal memory, every grandmother a library, every story a seed for the next generation. They began to change birth itself, out of necessity, out of pain, out of love. They learned to cushion the birthing mothers with moss, to heat stones and press them near swollen bellies, to use willow bark for the Paenae natural salagin, the ancestor of aspirin. They learned how to cut the cord, how to clean the wound, how to coax a breath from silent lungs. Each success was remembered, each death mourned, but not in silence, because for the first time grief was honoured. The first graveyards weren't for leaders, they weren't for warriors, they were for children, infants wrapped in fur, toddlers buried with beads, tiny skulls painted in ochre. Why? Because the mothers remembered. And when memory is love, it becomes ritual. They placed carved animals beside the dead. They painted suns and spirals on stone. They stacked antlers like gates around the grave. The body returned to earth, but the story stayed. A mother sat by the fire, her hands calloused, her hair streaked with the white of many winters. Around her, children gathered, not all hers by blood, but all hers by duty. She told the tale of the river that froze too soon, of the bear whose shadow taught them to fish, of the first fire stolen from the lightning tree. The children didn't just listen, they memorized. Because forgetting meant death, and remembering that was survival. The mother's voice was not loud, but it carried farther than the mammoth's roar, because it echoed in the minds of those who came after. Generation after generation, the story of the world passed through women's mouths. They carried more than tales. They carried symbols, little figurines, rounded, faceless, powerful. Fertility goddesses, some say, icons of hope, others argue. But the mothers knew they weren't gods, They were reminders of birth, of milk, of blood, of loss. To touch the figurine before labour was to whisper to every mother who'd come before. To bury it with a child was to beg the earth to be kind. These idols weren't worshipped, they were loved. And love in those cold days was the fiercest magic of all. Matrilineal lines began to shape memory. Ask a child, "Who are you?" They would answer, "I am the daughter of Tali, who was the daughter of Nema, who was the daughter of Sheen, who saw the white comet in the sky and sang it into stone. Not, I am of this tribe, not, I am from this place, but I am of this mother, of this bloodline, of this memory." And so the tribes began to understand lineage, inheritance, identity not as a story of ownership but as a chain of remembrance. Even in death, the mothers taught. In Donifer Stonite, archaeologists would one day uncover the oldest known cremation in Europe, the bones of a woman aged 40 buried with care. She was disabled, perhaps, a stroke victim, yet she lived long. She was fed, protected. Why? Because her brain held maps, her voice held recipes, her memory held answers. To lose her would be to forget how to survive winter, how to treat infection, how to find the spring herb that stops bleeding. In a world with no books, elders were scrolls, and mothers were the keepers of the index. Not all was soft, not all was sacred. The mothers also chose when to exile, when to bless, when to mourn and when to forget. Their stories were tools and sometimes weapons. A child who broke taboo might find their name unspoken. A woman who saved a tribe might live forever as a tale told by firelight. In this way, they ruled not with power, but with memory. And memory, in the deep past, was everything. They did not call it culture. They called it life. They did not see themselves as founders of anything. But in the quiet work of birthing, feeding, burying, teaching, they built the spine of Europe. Tribes grew larger. Wanderings became migrations. But at every camp, every river, every grave, there was a mother who remembered. And because she remembered, we are here. So look again at the timeline, at the tools, at the painted caves, at the idols and the bones. Behind each artifact a woman whose name is lost but whose work is not. You carry her mitochondrial DNA. You carry her stubbornness, her grief, her fire. You walk because she didn't fall. You speak because she sang. You dream because she remembered. She's not myth. She is your ancestor. She is you. And she never really left. Bones and boundaries. The world was no longer empty. The mammoth still roamed and the rivers still carved their silver scars through the hills, but now there were others. Not just animals, not just spirits in the sky. People. Other fires on distant ridges, other footprints in fresh snow, other eyes watching from the tree line. And so it began, the slow, uneasy awareness that this land, this river, this valley full of memory and mammoth bone might not be yours alone. Once the world had no borders. The land was wild, open, shared. A tribe wandered, and the earth yielded her gifts. But now, with more tribes, more mouths, more stories etched into every hillside, came conflict. Over land, over water, over herds, over honour. The first fights didn't start with weapons. They started with warnings. A deer carcass left unclaimed became a message. Here we hunt. Charcoal glyphs painted on a tree. Our fire is near. Piles of stones stacked deliberately, bones placed just so territorial signs in a language older than words. And when those signs were ignored, the warnings turned to wounds. A man stood over a hilltop with a stone blade in his hand. Below him, a valley, ripe, green, rich in wild barley, in rabbits, in memory. His mother gave birth in that cave. His brother died in that glade. His daughter spoke her first word by that river. To him, the land was not just useful, it was personal. And so, when strangers appeared tall, lean, sun-darkened and armed, he didn't see neighbours. He saw trespassers. And in that moment, territorialism was born. But blood was not spilled without reason. Not yet. Before the bone cracked, before the spear flew, there were talks. Gestures, grunts, gifts. A piece of flint in exchange for passage, a carved shell offered with outstretched palms, a nod, a shared fire, a wary meal eaten on opposite sides of a flame. Diplomacy, primitive but real. And sometimes it worked. A river became a border, a glade became neutral ground. A migration route was shared between tribes. But other times words failed. And then the ground grew wet. The skeletons tell the truth. At the borders of territories in narrow passes on ridgelines, near rivers we find them. Bodies with broken ribs, skulls split clean, spear points still buried in bone. Children with crushed arms, elders with defensive wounds. Archaeologists call them trauma patterns. But the truth is simpler. War. Not armies, not kings, but bands, clans, tribes, fighting over sacred land, over memory, over meaning. And yet, even in violence, rules began to emerge. You didn't kill during a birth. You didn't strike someone mourning. You didn't hunt another tribe's totem animal. These weren't written laws, they were codes. Passed down in songs, in warnings, in dreams. Break them, and you risked more than retaliation. You risked dishonour. And in a world of oral memory, dishonour was death. So came the first ceremonies, not just to celebrate, to bind. A birth was no longer just a breath and a cry. It was a fire lit, a name spoken, a totem carved. The tribe gathered, and a mother held her child to the stars and whispered, "You are of us now." The newborn's cord might be buried near the river, its first footprints marked in ochre on a stone. And just like that, a life was anchored. Unions, too, grew sacred. A man from one tribe and a woman from another did not just share warmth. They shared territory. A bridge was formed, a peace sealed in blood and breath. Hands were painted together on cave walls, gifts exchanged, antlers, beads, sacred shells. 2 fires burned side by side. And when their child was born, it carried both bloodlines, both songs, both stories. It belonged to the land in new ways. Death became structure, not just grief, but ritual. The body was not left to the wind, it was buried, with tools, with food, with symbols. The first cemeteries emerged, not grand, but consistent. Graves placed in sacred groves, bodies oriented east to west, ochre for the journey, antlers for protection. And over time, meaning deepened. Grave goods became more elaborate, bones arranged with intention. The dead were remembered not just for who they were, but for what they meant. Memory, once held in mothers, now began to hold space. You may hunt here, but you may not cross that ridge. This glade is ours, for our dead sleep beneath it. These stones mark a union. Break them, and you break a bond. And so, bones became boundaries. Ceremony became contract. Story became law. The first tribes were forming. Not just bands that wandered, but people with shared rituals, shared codes, shared lands. The Aurignacians, the Gravettians, the Magdalenian cultures. Names we gave them, but they had names of their own names lost to time, whispered to rivers, buried with the dead. Each tribe knew where it came from. Each knew its markings, its gods, its enemies. culture had roots now, and those roots had teeth. Not all tribes warred. Some became traders, ambassadors, bridge people. They knew the ways of many totems, spoke in symbols, carried news between valleys. They were honoured and sometimes feared, because those who walked between tribes walked also between truths. And yet, beneath all of it, beneath the blood and the bone and the boundaries, there was still wonder. The earth was still sacred. The stars still spoke. Even warriors knelt at graves. Even elders wept at births. And in the quiet moments, when the fire crackled low, a mother or father would tell the story of a time when the world had no borders. When every land was new and every fire welcomed strangers. And the child listening would ask, "Will it be that way again?" And the elder would pause and say nothing. Because some answers were not stories, they were choices. We are their children. We carry their codes, their instincts, their wounds. We draw borders, we build fences. But deep down in our blood, in our bones, we remember the river, the trail, the open sky. We remember the time before. And we still carry the choice to return, the ancestors in the mirror. Look in the mirror, not for your eyes, not for your skin, not for the line of your jaw. Look deeper, beneath the flesh, beneath the blood, beneath the names you've inherited from languages that did not yet exist. Because hidden inside you, woven into your every breath, is the journey of a people who did not vanish. They became you. They did not walk into myth. They walked into your cells. And when you breathe, they breathe again. You were told they were primitive, that they were bone and ash and silence. But science broke the silence, and DNA told a different story. It didn't come in drums or dreams. It came in code 4 letters, A, T, C, G, a script older than writing, older than fire, and in that script scientists found ghosts, Neanderthal fragments in your skin, Denisovan whispers in your immune system, a mutation here, a resistance there, all signed with the fingerprints of those who stood on ice-cloaked hills and watched mammoths pass beneath a red sun. They weren't lost. They were hiding in you. At first, we thought modern humans replaced them, wiped them out, won. But the genome said otherwise. We didn't just outlast them, we joined them. We mated, we mourned, we merged. And now their legacy pulses in your veins. 2% Neanderthal, up to 5% Denisovan in some Pacific populations. Echoes of ancient hybrid children whose names we'll never know but whose genes still speak. Not just in ancestry tests, but in real, tangible ways. How you sleep, how you store fat, how you respond to altitude, to infection, to fear. It's all there. A record not carved in stone but in you. Some carry the red hair of distant Neanderthal ancestors, some the broad cheekbones, some the immune quirks of Denisovan blood. But every feature, every flicker of instinct or shadow of reaction was shaped in the crucible of their world. Their choices, their suffering, their endurance is you. You are not their descendant. You are them. Think of your hands. Each finger, each bone within it is the latest version of something that grasped a flint blade 40,000 years ago. Think of your eyes. They evolved not just to see beauty, but to read warning in the shape of clouds, in the shadow of a predator. Think of your fear. It once kept your tribe alive through blizzards, through famines, through silent ambushes in the dark. These are not weaknesses, they're inheritances. Gifts from people who crossed glaciers barefoot, who lost children and kept walking, who sang to the dead and birthed gods from the firelight. You don't wear their memory. You wear them. A scientist holds a vial. Inside, DNA from a modern European, from a man with brown hair perhaps. Hazel eyes, he shops, he texts, He walks down cobbled streets built by Roman engineers. But in his genes, he carries the same mitochondrial markers as a woman who painted reindeer in a cave 30,000 years ago. He carries the same Y chromosome pattern as a man who watched the stars and whispered their meanings to his child before falling asleep in the warmth of mammoth hide. This isn't a metaphor. This is literal. This is testable. This is you. And the story doesn't end with Neanderthals or Denisovans. The genome tells us of interbreeding events we don't even have names for yet. Fragments from other archaic humans-lost tribes with no fossil evidence, but whose blood still flows in ours. They didn't build pyramids, they didn't write poetry, but they survived. And in doing so, they gave us pieces of themselves we can't begin to understand. There are unknown humans inside your known face. And every time science sharpens its lens, we find another ancestor smiling back through the fog. Look again at the history books, at the maps, at the theories drawn in ink. They show migration routes, arrows crossing Africa, threading through the Middle East, dividing into Europe and Asia. But those lines aren't just trails. They're bloodlines. You don't come from one place. You're the meeting point of 10,000 crossings, 10,000 choices. You're the echo of a girl who crossed the Caucasus with a wounded ankle and a stone doll, of a boy who knelt by the Danube to wash the ash of his grandfather from his hands, of a woman who buried her child with beads she carved from mammoth bone because she believed memory could conquer death. When you cry, you carry their grief. When you laugh, you carry their joy. When you dance, you honour their rituals. When you dream, you inherit the stories they left unfinished. They did not leave us behind. They're still moving through us. So the next time you look in the mirror, ask yourself, do you see a modern human? Or do you see a firelit face with soot on its cheeks and stars in its eyes? A soul born of migration and memory, of blizzard and blood. You carry a lineage so vast that your very cells struggle to hold it. And yet there you are, alive, unbroken. You are not separate from them. You are not the destination of their journey. You are the journey itself. Their bones are your bones. Their fire, your warmth. Their stories, unfinished in their throats or waiting in yours. To be remembered, to be retold, to be lived again. They crossed mountains, they crossed rivers, they crossed fear itself. And in doing so, they crossed into you. So when you ask, who am I? Know this. You're a million footsteps. You're 10,000 fires. You're the love and the war and the songs of people who should have died but didn't. And their reward was you. They crossed a continent. You crossed time to find them.